All right, so to make sense out of Book One of the Republic and really the entire Republic, we really need to analyze the opening couple of paragraphs. If you turn to page 128 and refamiliarize yourself with lines 327 through about 328, what you'll discover is that Socrates says he went down to the Piraeus. And when he went down to the Piraeus, he met Polemarchus and some other people. And in the first paragraph, it says that he had been attending a festival. So, first, a little bit of geography of Athens. Okay, so at the very top of the Athenian world was the Acropolis. And the Acropolis was the seat of Athenian government and religion. And it literally was like a cliff. You've certainly have seen pictures of this if you've seen any pictures of ancient Greece or Athens. Then underneath the Acropolis is where probably most of the people would have lived. So these would be, the houses and whatnot. And when he says the Piraeus, Athens had a port that was a couple of miles, and at one point it was actually surrounded by walls. And so the Piraeus, the word we get pirate from, was a bit of a distance. Okay, and so here the Piraeus is the port. And obviously the port is the place that all goods and services come through, or well, goods anyways, come through. And so in the opening lines it says Socrates was saying that he had gone down to the Piraeus and he went to enjoy the festival, and then he was on his way back up when Polemarchus stopped him. So interestingly enough, if you call to mind the tripartite soul that we looked at earlier, that's kind of what's going on here. The port, the Piraeus, right, is a place that brings in physical things, right? And these things are all related, obviously, to appetite, because indeed, what commerce and shipping goes on is about meeting people's physical needs. And it's also significant that he went to a festival. And the festival, of course, the word comes from the word for feast. So in a way, if you consider the tripartite soul, you have reason, where Socrates was, emotion, he went through, and ultimately to appetite. So Socrates literally and metaphorically went down to the appetites to have a good time, indulge his, need for feasting and fun, and he's on his way back up, and that is when Polemarchus stops him. And there's an interesting line where Polemarchus says, right around 327c, "It looks to me, Socrates, as if you two are starting off for Athens." "It looks the way it is then," I said. "Do you see how many we are?" He said. "I do." "Well, you must either prove stronger than we are, or you'll have to stay here. Isn't there another alternative, namely that you persuade us that we persuade you to let us go? You could not persuade us if we won't listen." So what's going on here is Polemarchus is very much in this world of the appetites, because he's coming from the Piraeus and he's trying to stop Socrates from ascending back to Athens. And he says, we will prevent you. Because if you think about the average soul, especially in a city that is, or a nation or culture, whatever, that's very commercial oriented, that's very much motivated by consumer items, you'd probably get a division of the soul like this. Here's reason, here's emotion, and all this is appetite. In other words, the appetites tend to control people and tend to drive the behaviors and actions and values in a nation that's become far more luxurious than it ought. And indeed, a guy like Polemarchus is very much a creature of this appetitive kind of reality. Okay, so then they go to Cephalus's house. And if you caught it, let's clear this. If you caught what Cephalus was saying, we'll go here. Cephalus shows up at line D, 328D, and he talks about Sophocles. So it's significant that he talks about Sophocles. This is Cephalus. And they begin the questioning around 328D, and Socrates asks him about the nature of money, and he asks him about what it's like getting old. And to that, Cephalus replies that he once heard Sophocles, when someone had asked him if he could still make love to a woman. This is on line 329, on page 129, line 329. And if you read that paragraph, what Cephalus suggests is that getting old, a lot of people think getting old is bad. And they think it's bad because you can't have fun like you used to. You can't, as he suggests, right around just a couple lines down from 329, when we meet the majority complain about the lost pleasures they remember from their youth, those of sex, drinking, parties, feasts, and a lot of the things that go along with them. And they get angry as if they have been deprived of important things and had lived well then, but are now hardly living at all. And then he talks about the poet Sophocles, and playwright, very famous Athenian playwright, very famous in his own day, which is also not always the case. And they asked him if he could still make love to a woman. And Sophocles said, "Quiet man, I am very glad to have escaped from all that, like a slave who has escaped from a savage and tyrannical master." That's at 329C. So Sophocles' point is essentially this: can he make love to a woman? No. But he's glad because he is now free from that. So in other words, you take a guy like Sophocles, and Sophocles' soul would be something like this, right? He likely would be a man who is, there's reason, there's emotion, appetite. For him, it's largely his sexual passions. And so this guy is, controlled largely by that, and his ruling parts are very small. And so to Sophocles, freedom can only happen when one loses the physical ability to do this anymore. And so then this tiny little bit here is allowed freedom. But it's interesting what Cephalus says. Cephalus says, in these matters and in the ones concerning relatives, the real cause isn't old age, Socrates, but the way people live. If they're moderate and contented, old age too is only moderately onerous. If they aren't, both old age and youth are hard to bear. That's 329D. So Cephalus disagrees with Sophocles, and he says that essentially the problem with Sophocles is he doesn't have any moderation. So perhaps a wise sentiment. Then Socrates begins to ask Cephalus about his money, and eventually he asks him to define justice. And there's a good understanding of justice that comes up around 330D. What I have to say probably wouldn't persuade most people, that paragraph. And we find a couple things out about Cephalus. First of all, he fears death. He's old, right? And he begins by talking about Socrates had asked him at just the line previous, so 330D-ish, what was the best thing about being rich? And he tells the story, where first he says that he fears death because he's afraid of having done unjust things, because there's atonement for unjust things. Hence, he says, after he talks about Hades and what for a little while, he says this at line 331D. Wealth can do a lot to save us from having to cheat or deceive someone against our will, and from having to depart from another place in fear because we owe sacrifice to God or money to a person. It has many other uses, but benefit to benefit, I'd say that this is how it is most useful to a man of understanding. So, basically, the answer to what is the good of money is that it provides justice in two ways. One, to not have to cheat and lie. And secondly, to pay back what you owe, pay debts to gods and men. Okay, so in other words, what he's saying is this. If you are poor and you have no money, you would have to cheat and lie in order to get money. And also, if you're poor, you wouldn't have enough money to either pay your debts or to sacrifice to the gods. Now, the idea behind sacrificing to the gods is when you sacrifice, like an expensive bull or something, it's almost like bribing the gods. You sacrifice something, they see your sacrifice, and then they forgive you for your injustices. So essentially, what Cephalus seems to be saying is that justice is about having money to pay your way out of things. Which is a rather interesting sentiment. So, because indeed, as long as you're rich, Cephalus suggests, you'll be all right in the afterworld because you won't have to suffer the consequences of your injustice. Because essentially, you can bribe the gods. Not to mention, you probably won't have to lie because you would be rich in the first place. Needless to say, this is a rather problematic understanding of justice. And Socrates questions him a little bit, and we discover that he says, Socrates asks him to refine it, and he says that yes, indeed, justice is about telling the truth and paying back your debts. And that comes up on line 331c. Very fine sentiment, Cephalus. But speaking of this very thing itself, namely justice, are we to say unconditionally that it is speaking the truth and paying whatever debts one has incurred? So justice equals speaking truth and paying debts. And this is Cephalus's definition of justice. Now, in the very next couple of sentences, Socrates said, well, there's times when paying debts will not be just. His example is if a friend has, if you leave weapons with a friend, and then when you're out of your mind, you go and ask for your weapons back, your friend would be doing you a disfavor if he gave you back your weapons when you're out of your mind. Likewise, he says, you wouldn't tell the truth to a madman. So in other words, paying debts can sometimes lead to unjust ends. Speaking the truth can also sometimes lead to unjust ends. Therefore, this does not function as a definition. And when he's called out on it, Socrates says, or asks him to clarify, and Cephalus says, I'll hand the argument over to you as I have to look after the sacrifice. And that's at line 331d. And so now Cephalus is out of the argument, and ironically, he is off to his sacrifice. So one wonders if, even though this doesn't make sense, it doesn't seem like Cephalus really cares what makes sense, because he wants to go and pay his debts to the gods to ensure that there is no injustice he's done that he hasn't paid, like literally paid money to take care of. Okay, so after this, we'll look into Republic Book 1 and 2, Part 2.